when we come to see you. The teddy bears are here to play. If you don't come play with us, then we will kill you.
Hello everybody. Welcome to a very special Top 5 Perfumes. This Top 5 list revolves around a story that was told to my childhood best friend and verified from her mother, her mother's neighbor, her mother's neighbor's son, her mother's neighbor's son's girlfriend, her mother's neighbor's son's girlfriend's father. So there is good provenance to the validity of what I'm about to tell you. 50 years ago, there was a minister who was whack-nut crazy, but he was very charismatic, and he really knew how to talk people into doing things they normally wouldn't do. He was a cult leader, and his followers grew in numbers. Once this minister had gained enough followers, he talked them into separating from the rest of the world, going up into the mountains and starting their own town in order to be able to practice religious freedom. After searching for many hours up in the mountains on this old logging road, they saw a dirt road that turned off to the left and followed it. It was heavily overgrown. Lots of grass and weeds and wildflowers and trees had grown all along the sides and in the tracks, but they managed to make it through. And at the end of this road, there was this huge clearing, and there was just one little homestead there, an abandoned homestead. The preacher came out of his truck and declared, "This will be our town." So they started building. They cut down trees and made that clearing bigger and bigger and bigger, until finally they had built enough houses and a little store. They even had a little petrol station where once a year they would go down into the main city and gather supplies they couldn't take care of for themselves, because they mostly lived off the land and needed no help from the outside world, except for when it came to fuel and a few other necessities. Anytime anyone tried to go up there and visit the town, whether it was just to check on their welfare, to make sure everybody had what they needed, including police officers, social workers, and the like, they were always driven out of town before they could enter by the townspeople. About 10 years ago, they stopped coming down for supplies. Now, the first year that was weird, but everybody thought, well, maybe they don't need anything this year, so nobody thought much of it. Then another year went by, and another year. So finally the sheriff was like, okay, they may try to drive me off, but I have got to go up there and check on them. So he didn't want to go by himself, just in case. So he brought a couple deputies, a social worker with him to make sure that they had a good team of support in case anybody needed anything. 2 cars and 4 people drove for a good hour and a half up that logging road until they hit the fork in the road in which they took the left to go into the town. Well, it was another 30 minutes on the dirt road because it had overgrown quite a bit. The townspeople kept that road pretty clear because that was their only way in and out of the town. And so the sheriff was very suspicious when he saw how overgrown it was. But they kept driving. When they first drove into the town, all that lined the main street were their simple little homes, the one store, and that small gas station. At the very end of the road was the church. This church was like no other church the sheriff had ever seen. It had huge cut stone bricks lining its walls. It was tall and Gothic and had 4 spires that reached up as tall as the tallest trees in this forest. The spires had wrought iron symbols on the very top. The sheriff looked at the symbols, but he wasn't sure what they were. He expected to see crucifixes, or at least a cross. But these symbols were different. He didn't know what they were, but it gave him a lot of unease. So the sheriff took charge and said, well, we'll split up, but we're just going to look in the homes and the store and meet up here in 45 minutes. When they entered the home, some of them had food on the dining room tables. Of course, it was all dried up, but it looked like they had cooked a meal and then never sat down to eat it. So once they searched all of the homes and the store and the gas station, they all met up in front of the big Gothic church. They got to these two mighty wooden doors with wrought iron handles on them. He half expected it to be locked, so was taken aback a little bit when he pulled on the wrought iron handle and it opened right up, but not quietly. When they opened the doors and started to enter, they turned on their flashlights, since it was quite dark inside of the church, even though it was daytime outside. When they entered, the first thing the sheriff noticed was this wonderful smell of wood. This beautiful, rich cedar smell was coming through. It took him by surprise. He expected, with everything looking so abandoned, it to be dusty and dirty. But the church inside was clean. First thing the sheriff thought of was one of his favorite perfumes, Dance Sauvage by Chris Collins. Because that Dance Sauvage was one of his favorite woody perfumes, that of course is the first perfume that came to mind when he entered the church. With the cedar and the plum and the boozy notes and the spices and the amber. He couldn't help but think about that perfume as he walked farther into the church, realizing, yeah, I need to wear that more often. That is a good perfume. And the performance is really good on it as well. Has wonderful sillage. It's very unisex. But as the sheriff, I prefer to wear it and not let my wife wear it quite so often as I do. And the sheriff also thought about when he bought it off of Chris Collins's website. It was under $200, he recalls, and thought it was worth every penny, with that warm, woody smell, a little bit of boozy, just a hint of sweet, but a very warm, rich kind of a wood smell. As he and the people with him got farther into the church, they started to enter the main cathedral. And that's when they realized why it was so dark and they needed their flashlights. There were 4 huge stained glass windows, 2 on each side of the cathedral. They didn't have bright colors on them, and they didn't depict religious scenes he was ever aware of. They were all in blood reds and onyx blacks and forest greens, and they depicted a battle between angels and demons with humans in the middle. But the angels and the humans were losing in every one of the depictions. The dread just grew in the sheriff, and he looked to either side, and the people that were with him were starting to sweat. Once they stepped inside of the cathedral, another aroma hit the sheriff hard. It was the smell of incense and spices. He couldn't help but think of one of his wife's favorite perfumes at that point, Memoir A Woman by Amouage. Because of the incense and cloves and wormwood and other woody smells and spices that are in it, it just made him heady for a second, thinking of his wife whenever she wore that very dark Gothic perfume. And he remembered how she put it on before dinner, before they went out for dinner one night, and how he could smell it easily on her the next morning. So he was thinking, boy, that thing performs really well. But he thought it was a little on the spendy side, but it was worth it. The only thing was, she always complained she didn't know what kind of occasions to wear it to, because it was a really specific, intense perfume. And he thought, going to church in this church, that would be an occasion to wear that perfume. As they walked down the main aisle of the cathedral, lined with pews on either side, and old hymnals laying on the floor or tattered on the pews themselves, he looked up and saw the candelabras that lined each of the aisles and smelled their waxy sweetness. Since the sheriff knew they lived off the land, he was sure that's how they made their candles, was from their apiary. And when he saw those melted candles and got those wafts of sweet wax, it made him think of a perfume that him and his wife both enjoy by 4160 Tuesdays, called Captured by Candlelight, and how it smells like toffee and beeswax and boozy notes, and how much he loves it when his wife wears it, because it smells so much different on her than it does on him. And he thought to himself, boy, I haven't worn that one in a while. It smells so good on my wife. I'm not sure I'm going to wear it again. I really like the way it performed. I remember I got a good 6-7 hours out of it pretty easy, and sillage and projection were pretty good on it as well. And the 4160 perfumes, their prices are outstanding. Most of them are right at $100, give or take 10. As he started making his way down the aisle with his company, he looked up and noticed a huge hole in the roof of the church. He thought, how strange. Just one big hole. There's no tree. It's not rotted. So why is there this huge hole? He couldn't see it perfectly, but because of the aroma, he knew those must be blackberry brambles that were also growing through the hole and into the church. And that reminded him of a new perfume he just discovered from a house named Svensk. And the perfume was called Pratt. When he smelled those blackberry brambles, the berries and the leaves and the vines, it just totally brought him into when he first wore that perfume and how much he fell in love with it, and thought, I should put this on my wife as well, because I bet this would smell really good on her too. Because that perfume is all about the blackberry leaves and the blackberries, and some rhubarb and some other berries and some earthy notes. And he thought, yeah, it performs pretty good. I remember getting 5-6 hours out of it on an average, and the prices are pretty good on them as well. So then he shook his head and snapped, why am I thinking of perfumes when I'm here investigating an entire town disappearing? He thought, come on, Sheriff, get your head in the game. So they got closer and closer to the altar. This altar was made out of wood and stone, and the slab of the stone on the top was just smashed, and the wood that was supporting it was burned. But the very center of the altar, no break, no nothing. And on that was a cup. When the sheriff looked in the cup, he couldn't believe it. There was wine in the cup. How is that possible after all these years, that there's still wine? He could tell it had dehydrated quite a bit, so it wasn't fresh. It had been there a while, but not as long as the town had been gone. And when he saw that wine, it reminded him of a perfume too. Immediately when he smelled that aged wine, it hadn't turned to vinegar, but it reminded him of Liquids Imaginaires Bello Rebello. With that red wine and dried fruit accord that he was smelling from this cup, it was so concentrated. And then with the wood underneath he could smell. Remember, there's also some resins and labdanum in that perfume that he doesn't smell here. That was the difference he noticed between what he was smelling at this altar and the perfume itself. And that's a perfume he thought, no, I really like wearing that one. I don't really share that one with my wife nearly as often as I do some of my other ones. I know she loves it, but that one's mine. I do wish it performed a little better though. I get 4 or 5, maybe 6 hours out of it depending on the season. And it projects pretty good for the first half an hour to an hour. But after that it becomes pretty close to the skin. So as he lamented the performance of Bello Rebello, he looked down and noticed there was something next to the cup. Next to the cup were some dried roses. Now they didn't look like they were over a month old. Now they hadn't fallen apart, but they were completely desiccated red roses sitting at the base of the cup. When he saw the roses, he picked them up, and instinctively he just brought them to his nose to smell them, as if they were fresh and alive. When he took a big breath in of those dried roses, he couldn't help but think of another perfume, and that was Stranger's Perfumery's Lava Rose. That heavy, dried rose note, which he experienced now, he remembers experiencing when he was testing Lava Rose, and how beautiful it was, how the incense and the heat notes and the soil notes made it just smell very niche, very hot, a little sweet, very sophisticated, and wonderfully unique. That was a perfume that he actually stole from his wife. She was wearing it first, but he fell so in love with it on his own skin. He loved it on her, but he loved it on him more, so he snagged that perfume because he went ahead and let her have Captured by Candlelight. So he thought it was only fair that he gets to keep Lava Rose. The performance was pretty good with it as well. It projected well and lasted about 6 hours when he wore it the last time. He thought, Lava Rose is a perfume I'm going to really enjoy wearing once it gets snowy out. Then he snapped out of it again. And he thought, why do I keep thinking of perfumes? I guess it's because of all these aromas I'm surrounded with. So once the sheriff, the deputies, and the social workers had searched the church thoroughly, they found no one. Nobody was there. No bones, no bodies, nothing. The sheriff put the dried roses back down on the tattered altar, placing them gently next to the cup as he had found them. The 2 deputies and the social worker had started to go back down the aisle towards the doors in order to leave. He took one more look around. He looked up at the hole. He looked down at the altar. And he just wondered, what was it that came through that hole and smashed that altar and burned it like it was? He kind of jokingly thought maybe it was a lightning bolt. He turned from the altar and saw the 2 deputies and the social worker pushing open the big double doors and exiting the church. The doors stayed open for a second and then slammed shut. The sheriff didn't want to be scared, but he couldn't help himself. Him and his flashlight went running down the aisle. He thought, nobody will see how spooked I am right now. And he got to the door and he couldn't open them. He tried and tried to open the doors and nothing. He started pounding on the doors so that the others would know he was trapped in here. He couldn't hear them either. He pounded harder, yelled louder, and he used his radio on his shoulder, calling the 2 deputies. Nothing but silence. He called again on his radio, demanding that they answer him. And nothing. He yelled louder the social worker's name, but no reply. Then he heard footsteps by the altar, walking on some of the crushed stone that had fallen from its top. He didn't want to turn around, but he knew he had to. So with the flashlight in his left hand pointed towards the door, he carefully unsnapped his holster and pulled his weapon from it. He began to turn slowly with his gun pointed in front of him. He finally turned, his flashlight barely able to illuminate the end of the aisle. And that's when he saw them. And then